Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Schilling. Welcome to this episode of Capitola Memories. Today, we're at the longtime downtown home of Patrick McCormick, former planning director for the city of Capitola. Patrick, thank you for being with us.
It's good to see you again.
So we'll begin with a little bit about yourself, and could you share where you were raised and how you came to learn of civic life?
Well, I was born and raised in 1950 in Fresno, California. If you want to know what my living was like, just watch an episode of Leave It to Beaver. Standard family starting their first home after World War II, and just a standard subdivision track out at the edge of town in northwest Fresno. Was lucky enough to get into UC Santa Cruz in 1968, and it was the only place I applied, and thrived there. I was a math and computer science major at entry, and for my first 3 years, and it was tumultuous times in the late 60s. And so I got interested in planning and civic issues because there was a proposal to turn what is now Wilder Ranch State Park into an addition to the city of Santa Cruz that would be the same size as the city. It would double the size of the city in population. It would take a freeway from San Jose to here to get the people to the new homes, and that just seemed like a crazy idea, and it would despoil the property, cause sprawl along the coast, and I was wondering who are making these decisions and how did they get made.
So planning caught your attention, and government entities. Okay, so there you were, a college graduate, and within a few years you're working for Capitola. What are some of your memories before you even applied for the job? Can you recall what Capitola meant to you in the early 70s?
I was living in Capitola, and I was working as a planning technician for the county of Santa Cruz, which is the lowest position in the department. It's definitely sub-policy stuff. I was enforcing the zoning ordinance.
So how about as a resident of Capitola at that time? You had a few years enjoying the Esplanade.
I loved Capitola. It was the early 70s, so it was still the poor person's Carmel. It was inexpensive living, and it had a little cultural life to itself, distinct from the big city of Santa Cruz.
Like, what do you remember of the cultural life of Capitola, or some of your favorite places?
Well, Capitola Theater was a wonderful institution. It showed two shows. Was cheap. The Jacobs were the owners and were longtime local business people. I could walk down to the theater from my home on 42nd Avenue, and there was always a cheap place to eat, or a slightly less cheap place to eat if you had a few extra dollars and you wanted to splurge. Aries Arts and the Craft Gallery were sort of the cultural places. There was a coffee shop, restaurant, I think it was called the Ark, where you could hang out. It was actually before Mr. Toots. Mr. Toots started when I was living there later.
And you mentioned that Capitola was surrounded with fields. Is a image you had of the time?
Oh yes, northwest corner of 41st, behind Sears, was Brown Ball Branch, and there were still begonia gardens north of Capitola Road between 44th and 46th. So there was still its agricultural past was dwindling, but it was still there.
You entered working for the city in 1975, and how did you come to have that job?
Well, I was working for the county without a professional degree in an entry-level job, and I lived in Capitola, loving it. I liked living there. I had no debt. I had no family. I had very few possessions, and the job became available. So I just applied with a pretty meager resume. Fortunately, I had not been participating in any of the local politics. If I had, it probably would have doomed me, whichever group I was associated with. So I was totally disassociated with town politics when I applied. And they were not paying very well. So that cut down the competition. And the council itself was split 3-2 whether to even hire a planner. Town had a pretty small budget. Could the building official do the work? Which is what was happening before I got hired. They actually had a full-time planning director before me, and he left. I'd say it was a contentious divorce on all sides. So some of the council didn't even want to replace that position. But by a 3-2 vote, the council decided they wanted to replace it. So the city manager did the job search. And I got offered the job. I didn't even negotiate salary. And got a wonderful training experience. Well, I had some of my contemporaries off at graduate school learning how to be planners and getting a master's degree. Well, the good citizens of Capitola were trusting me to learn it on the job, and it was a wonderful way to become a planner. I'm not sure it would work today, but it worked then.
What were some of the first experiences you had, either politically, to say what the tenor was at that time, or what was up the first year on your job?
Well, the town was, the big issues were planning and some operational issues in the police department.
So when you say the big issue is planning, and that's in the context of planning as a whole field evolving in the 70s, so how was that manifesting in Capitola? Was it around signage or around zoning, or how were they having their growing pains?
There were a number of fields. One was there was a building moratorium because the sewage treatment plant was down at the beach, was at primary level, and didn't meet the state and federal Clean Water Act standards. So we were going to have to figure out some alternative, and there were state and federal grants to help us do that, to meet the Clean Water Act standards for the ocean. So we had a building moratorium, we had growth pressures building up. The community was growing starting in the 60s.
Were design factors being talked about at that time?
Yes, I would say there were two main factions in the community. The majority of the council represented the old guard.
What did that mean?
That meant sort of standard architecture or lack of thereof, or being tolerant of whichever design a builder wanted to build, whether it was a house or an apartment building or a store. And then there was a growing faction in the community that wanted to see more careful design. They had some concerns about some of the bigger apartment buildings. And so there were two members on the council at that time that were associated with that faction. So design was important.
Would you say it was just beginning, or was it pretty far along? I mean, many years were spent after that on the design of Capitola, but I just wonder if it was just emergent, or did it set the tone right then?
Well, they were fighting like crazy at the council, and most of the city elections were decided on planning issues. Everything from the Catholic Church at Capitola and Bay, being the old historic building being torn down, to some of the newer apartments and condominiums along Park Avenue, along Kennedy, Monterey.
So those were issues that defined the candidates' platforms?
Yes.
Yes. So Capitola was an early adapter for this federally subsidized affordable housing in our county. And were you involved with some of those projects?
Yes, probably the biggest residential project that happened when I was at Capitola was Capitola Gardens project, which is north of Capitola Road between 44th and 46th. In the early 70s, it was still begonia gardens for the Vetterleys, and the Vetterleys went out of business and sold their property, which was vacant at that point, begonia gardens. And so the property was bought by a low and moderate income housing developer out of LA, Goldrich Kest. And the city had zoned the property for 15 units per acre, and they felt like they could do a project at that density. And it went through the architectural review and the planning commission, and was of modest architecture. I think we allowed them to sort of keep the materials cheap and the designs plain, because it was going to be 30-year low and moderate income housing. The developer used federal financing in exchange for the 30 years of affordability, which ran out in 2006.
Do you know if it was renewed?
I don't know what happened with it.
It's still, I think they're still taking vouchers there and using it in that way. Was that a controversial project at that time?
No, it wasn't controversial. The much more controversial projects were the market rate projects, the apartments along Park, the condos along Park, the condos along Monterey and Kennedy. They were large, and they were sort of out of character with how a lot of people in Capitola saw the community's visual character.
Well, I have a few more questions about downtown Capitola. We were talking about the design of how the village came to look the way it looked. And you said that there's a story about the particular light fixtures.
Yes, and this is a good sample of both long-term concerns and also sort of a different way of doing it. Capitola uses used PG&E to maintain all of their light fixtures. So it's just like municipal, the utility maintains their lights rather than the city. And it's one option. It's how Capitola did it. So we were doing an undergrounding of the utilities, long-term value.
Mm-hmm.
Don't want to look at the utility lines in the village. And the manager was an engineer and was of the old school. And PG&E walked in with their standard light fixture, and he said, "Oh, that'll be fine." And I worked for him. I didn't think it was a good idea. I thought there should at least be, do we have any options? Because it was a pretty ugly metal and plastic affair. So I walked across the street to one of the village people who was active in the village merchants, to Bernie Waymeyer, and she was one of the movers and shakers, and I showed her a diagram of the new light fixtures proposed to go on the newly installed light fixtures in the village, new poles in the village. And she went ballistic, so she mobilized the village merchants to put pressure on the manager and the council to find an option that was more in character with the village, and that's what got built.
Mission accomplished there, and enjoyed through till today.
Well, and it's how things get done. And in this small town, and probably in most towns.
Responsive government in Capitola.
But I couldn't have done it as staff because the city manager was comfortable with the standard product from PG&E.
But citizen involvement has been a big factor in Capitola's character, more so than other cities, I'd say.
Absolutely. And when I went to Capitola, I was predisposed against qualitative design review, which Capitola had, architectural site review they call it. In my 2.5 years at Capitola, they changed my mind. That just doing quantitative standards that any engineer or architect can design to isn't enough. I thought the city did pretty well doing qualitative design review. I don't like the way that looks.
They converted you. The community converted you.
Me.
Okay.
There was a community standard, you know, and it worked well to have a design review commission, architectural site review, it's called, and when we were reviewing the Capitola Gardens apartments at an evening meeting at City Hall, the power went out. And somebody from the police department stuck their head in the door and said, "It'll be out for a long time." There was an accident somewhere, knocked out a light utility pole. So I put a sign on the City Hall. We've gone down to the River's End bar on the Esplanade. If you're looking for the Architectural and Site Review Committee meeting, please come down. So the public, there may not have been anybody from the public, but the 4 members of the Architecture Review Committee, me and the developer, we went down to River's End. Developer wanted to buy some pitchers of beer, and I said, "Oh, no, the city will do this." So I bought some beer and I bought some soda. We sat down around a big table and had a wonderful meeting with the Architecture Review Committee asking for changes in the design. And it was the interdynamics was really nice because it wasn't people on one side of a fence up on a raised dais and other supplicants out in the audience. We were just sitting around the table. The dynamics worked really well. We should have more meetings like that. I went back to City Hall the next day and put in a voucher for the refreshment costs, and that's how things were done.
Great. Well, let's move on to the big story for Capitola, the annexation of the Capitola Mall. So you were on that project both as an employee of Capitola and sometime later also working for LAFCO.
Actually, my whole story is when I was at the Capitola, because I didn't get to LAFCO until 1980.
Okay. Well, then tell about those few years and how this opportunity came to Capitola.
Well, during the 60s, there were 3 general plans, and in California, each community is required to have a general plan under state law, but the state doesn't tell the communities how to plan or what to plan. And the city of Santa Cruz, the city of Capitola, and the county of Santa Cruz all planned for a regional shopping center. So there was consensus of each of the 3 communities that the northwest corner of 41st and Capitola Road was the one best location for a regional mall, and that each community wanted a suburban type mall. The city of Santa Cruz's position was their city limit was at the Yacht Harbor, and they didn't want to annex Live Oak unless they also got the revenue on 41st in order to pay for the municipal services. The county's position was they were ready to permit a mall there if asked, and the city of Capitola's position was if they had an opportunity they would annex it and permit a mall. So the market in Santa Cruz County got to the point where a developer was willing to go forward. It was called Sutter Hill out of Palo Alto. Rich McMichael was the main person I dealt with for the developer. And at this point I'm the planning director in Capitola. Developer, Sutter Hill, turned in their application to the county to build a mall. And the county, on a 3-2 vote, balked at saying yes. There were slow growth concerns. There were interests that maybe the city of Santa Cruz would not help the city if a lot of business was taken out of Santa Cruz and moved to 41st, that they would lose revenue and dynamic business. There was definitely the beginning of the growth control movement, and we don't want to be suburbia, we don't want to be like San Jose, and this is taking us well down the road. So the county board of supervisors, on a very split vote,
missed their chance.
They missed their chance, and they didn't say yes, but they sort of balked at saying yes, and didn't really provide a degree of certainty to the developer that the developer could do something and then get an approval from the county. It might have been a no, it might have been a yes, but the county didn't say what.
Right. So there was Capitola watching all this, and they would have to initiate the sphere of influence request.
Well, it would be an annexation, and they were across the street, where the northeast corner of 41st and Capitola Road was at that point in Albertsons. Now it's Whole Foods. So they were right across the street. So it's easy to annex. There was contiguity. So the developer came to Capitola and said, well, if I annex to Capitola, would you let me build a mall? And the city manager said, oh yes, be our guest. So the first thing to do was to annex. So the developer and the other property owners applied to annex in a very controversial set of hearings. LAFCO on a very split vote.
Patrick, let me ask you technically there. Wouldn't it have been the city's application to annex rather than the developers? And how did that play out within the council itself?
It doesn't matter whether the developer or the city is the applicant. They have to decide between them who actually fills out the LAFCO application. It doesn't matter.
And in this case, the developer.
I don't even remember because it didn't much matter. Capitola would have been
Capitola was so into it.
Right.
Okay.
So I do have a story.
Tell it.
Well, there are 5 people in LAFCO. In order for the annexation to be approved, Capitola needed 3. So it's very much the city staff's job to flesh out 3 votes and work with the elected officials to assure that 3 votes can be delivered at LAFCO. Mm-hmm. So at the time, on LAFCO, there are 2 city council members from 4 of the cities. There are 2 Board of Supervisors members. And those 4 people appointed a 5th public member who is not an elected official. And city staff quickly were able to count 2 yes votes and 2 no votes.
So you were working with the council members to count those votes, and you had a 2-2.
We were trying to assure a 3rd vote. So the city manager and the mayor invited the mayor of Watsonville over to City Hall. The mayor of Watsonville was Bill Johnston. Mayor of Capitola was Hill Nelson, and city manager was Max Clute. I worked for Max. Max asked me to sit in on the meeting to answer any technical questions or procedural questions that Mayor Johnston might have. Mm-hmm. Johnson. So we're meeting in the city manager's office in Capitola. Beforehand, Capitola had decided that it was a small jurisdiction. The mall was going to generate a whole lot of sales tax, and that we were actually willing to share that with some of the other jurisdictions in the county, which, if need be. So we talked about that ahead of time, and that was a card that the city manager and the mayor could play, if need be, to get Watsonville's vote. The city manager turned to Mayor Johnston of Watsonville and said, "We really like your vote on the annexation. What are your needs? What can we do for you?" And at which point the mayor of Watsonville said, "Nothing. We'll support your annexation." And he used some rather crude language about one of the LAFCO commissioners who was county supervisor, Gary Patton, mm-hmm. that he was going to be more than welcome to provide a vote on the other side of the issue from Gary. So Capitola did not have, at that point Capitola would have given away a lot of sales tax revenue to Watsonville if they'd asked, but they didn't ask. If you will remember, in the mid-70s, there were 2 department stores in downtown Watsonville and 2 in downtown Santa Cruz. and a lot of ancillary shops. Well, the mall was going to suck a lot of retail activity out of both downtowns. And that was a big issue, and it was one of the reasons why the city of Santa Cruz opposed the annexation and ultimately sued LAFCO and the city and the developer over it.
Let's get into that aspect of the project. So it had been approved by LAFCO, and then the story continued. You could see that coming, Santa Cruz opposition to it.
Yes, this would have been 75. The city of Santa Cruz sued, saying that LAFCO failed to follow the California Environmental Quality Act, and that LAFCO failed to follow the LAFCO law in approving the annexation. We went through many courts over several months, and for an annexation to be official, there's a piece of paper that the city records in Sacramento. Normally it's just a very routine clerical thing, but the minute that piece of paper is recorded, the annexation's done. And all the Capitola laws apply, Capitola plans apply, and Capitola can issue a building permit. So Capitola had been taking the mall through architectural reviews so that it would be at a point where the developer could submit some building plans and get those reviewed and approved while the litigation was going on, challenging the LAFCO decision. There was a restraining order against LAFCO filing this piece of paper in Sacramento. No. That's the official act. You can't do that while the litigation's pending. Well, the city attorney, Rich Manning, came to the city staff and said, as the litigation resolves, if we ever get to a point where I can get the restraining order dissolved, I want you to run to Sacramento. And it was before cell phones, and I don't want you to even call until you've recorded the piece of paper in case there's an effort to get a subsequent restraining order after the first one is dissolved. Because I'd much rather be arguing from a position of, well, it's in the city now.
I couldn't reach him. He was up there doing business,
Right.
and I couldn't reach him.
So one day the city manager, and the building official, city manager was Max Clute, the building official was Bill Clark, and I took a dry run. We just got in the car in the morning, drove to Sacramento, went to the Secretary of State's office and said, where are annexations filed? And they said, go down the hall and talk to a certain lady. And we went down the hall and talked to a certain lady and said, we're going to have a really important annexation piece of paper. Oh, by the way, here's some See's candies. Are you the person we come to? How many hours of the day are you here? If we're not here, who do we talk to? It was a nice 5-minute conversation. Then we got back in the car and drove back to Capitola, and that was a full work day for 3 people of the city management staff. And the real paperwork sat on the corner of the city manager's desk. And of the building official and the city manager and I, if the city attorney called any one of us at any time of the day, our instructions were, grab that piece of paper, drive it up to Sacramento, record it, and don't call us.
And that day came.
Yes, and when the call came in, actually I didn't get to be the one to drive it to Sacramento. I think the same manager.
So there began the Capitola Mall.
Yes,
and
it was open. The opening day was in '76.
So Patrick, here we are more than 40 years later with the Capitola Mall having had a good run and fantastic revenue pouring in to support the Capitola social services and parks and all of its culture and many other things there. And we see the mall emptying in the last few years to the point of the city now holding scoping sessions about how do we repurpose this mall. What are your comments on how this looks from a planning point of view, and how could you have predicted it?
Not in 1976, I could not have predicted it. We saw malls as being a strong fixture in American society, and the one thing I, at least, there was a glint of prediction, was that before we started the review process at the city, the building official and I went around to different shopping malls in the Monterey and San Francisco Bay Area to decide what we liked and what we didn't like, to inform the architectural review process. And I liked the open malls. Monterey is an example. It turned out that that was a deal breaker for the developer. Well, looks like the current fashion and the current mall owner is going to open up and make it more village like, and less of a huge mega structure.
So here we are with your many years in planning and seeing all kinds of things play out. I'm going to give you an imaginary magic wand and briefly summarize what you think the opportunity is for Capitola in the redevelopment of that mall.
Well, first let me say I think Capitola is lucky in that it's a big piece of property in a developed urban area, and we've got the market to support a range of options. I would get excited about as much housing as they can fit on the site. The 65 foot height limit wouldn't scare me at all, as long as both the land uses, the number of units, and the design were okay. It's a big enough site to handle a 65 foot limit, as long as it's not too bulky. I don't think there's a need for any more movie theaters at this point in the county, and I think big boxes they aren't going to last, but those are opportunities. When Santana Mall, when Santana Row was built in San Jose, the first time I went, it just felt really weird. It felt like Disneyland. And it has grown on me. You know, they actually built a space, had the audacity to build a European street on a cul-de-sac off Stevens Creek Boulevard, and it works. Now, Capitola Mall shouldn't become Santana Row, but I think the place can be recreated that's going to last another 50 years and hopefully more than that, with a lot of residential and more modest businesses.
Okay, I can see it as you're describing it. And as we look at the historic playout of the Capitola Mall development and the growth of Capitola, can you comment on then the transition of its neighboring property of Live Oak and how that was impacted, and in that way the county?
Yes, the inclusion of the Capitola Mall in Capitola, along with the other annexations in the 41st Avenue area, have taken away any glimmer of possibility that Live Oak would ever incorporate as a separate city. It's just not enough revenue there. And it's actually made it unattractive for either the city of Santa Cruz or the city of Capitola to annex into Live Oak. Residential areas cost cities money to provide services to. They don't generate monies. So, for better or for worse, Live Oak is stuck with the county being their general government and getting services from a combination of the county and the fire district and the sanitation district. So bet on the status quo for the future of
was that discussed at the time of the annexation in any way, or was the focus just get this mall in there?
No, it was heavily debated. Again, Santa Cruz said they'd like to annex out to 41st, but only if they can annex to 41st. The Live Oak community was split into many thoughts, and there were two civic groups, the Community Association and Local G.
But the Live Oak community was split, so it did not advocate strongly one way or another for its future either.
There were strong advocates, but some wanted to annex to Santa Cruz, some wanted to stay unincorporated, and some wanted to incorporate. And so there was just too much energy going in the different directions. In the late 60s, early 70s, LAFCO put an annexation moratorium to try and give the community an opportunity to sort through some options. Another option was what's called the single city option, which was a single mid-county city going from the Yacht Harbor to the Seascape. So that was looked at in addition to these other options we've talked about.
That was a concurrent discussion prior to the annexation application?
That's right. So the 60s and the very early 70s was when the big thinking was done. So and we've ended up with sort of default little thinking.
And do you think that that was the default of many forces not defining themselves, or based on Capitola's aggression to get it?
I wouldn't say what Capitola was aggressive at all. They this fell into their hands, and they just said yes. They weren't scheming ever to get it. It just walked in the front door, and city manager said yes, and there was a consensus.
Well, to hear you mention all the factors in play at that time, I'm surprised to hear that the Santa Cruz city politics were definitely having an influence, even though they weren't fully stepping into it in terms of their downtown, wanting to retain the downtown, and also the growth factors. So these two city forces very much influenced a county decision that far out.
Yes, and the city forces were both the sort of the slow growth, good planning forces, and the old Chamber of Commerce. No, we don't want our, we're the shopping center for the county. We want to continue to be. We don't want to lose a lot of both revenue and commercial activity.
How would you summarize the impact of the Capitola Mall decision on Santa Cruz City today? Do you think it was a good decision for that city?
Well, I think Santa Cruz just had to play the cards that got dealt with them to them, and they ended up with an earthquake and have ended up with an entirely different downtown than they had before. They still are losing revenue to Capitola. The county's losing revenue to Capitola. It's still a sales tax generator. So the city of Santa Cruz, I think, has done fine because they've repurposed their downtown after the earthquake, fortunately. I think the city of Watsonville is still suffering. I remember when there was a Penny's and Ford's, a Ford's and a Penny's in downtown Watsonville, and all the little stores in between were pretty active. The city in Watsonville, they're still trying to get some activity downtown with some limited success, and they have developed out on Main Street standard shopping centers to try and capture the business. So they're stumbling along too with the cards that were played to them.
So when you say big thinking and small thinking, do you think the opportunity in front of Capitola now with repurposing it will aspire to have bigger thinking, or how do you predict it will go?
Yeah, I think they are ready to work with the developer and know what they like and what they don't like. We're watching development occur now in Aptos Village. Scotts Valley's been unable to kick off their village center, and they've tried through several developers. I think Capitola's in great shape. The market is there. As much housing as you can fit on the site of any level, economic level, will work. That then becomes how much you can fit on the site and still have the commercial activity. So I think Capitola, it's a high chance of success. I don't know what it'll look like because that's a community decision, and developer's going to have to spend a lot of money.
Does it make you wish you were back being the planning director for Capitola?
Yeah, I think it would be fun. There's a lot of more process than there was. So, when I saw the original plans for the Capitola Mall on my desk, there was a lot more. I think at the time the staff did actually more of the decision making and deferred some of the major decisions to the Planning Commission and the City Council. Now the process is much more inclusive. At least there's a potential for a process that's much more inclusive, and the developers already sort of rolled out their PR presentation trying to solicit, and then at some point the city will do the same thing. So it's going to be more of a come in and tell us what you want. Okay, this is what we heard. Is this the plan that meets those aspirations? Okay. So I'd love to be there now.
Well, let's summarize and we've covered a lot of territory and topics for the last 40 years in Capitola and your career. Do you have any summary comments about Capitola then and now, or?
Well, I've always loved Capitola. It was stressful to work there as a young person when planning issues were huge. So I can enjoy it now. In fact, I've enjoyed it for many years after I left, which was 1979, 1980. So I've enjoyed it to visit. And it's a special place, and I think the people who live there are trying to keep it special, and I wish them well.
Well, you had a big part in keeping it special, Patrick. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for interviewing me, Elizabeth.
Capitola, come to the coast with me. The sun and the sky are free. We'll play in the sand and sea. Capitola, paradise you'll adore. I'll take your hand there on the sand along the shore. Capitola, over the bridge we'll go. We'll capture the sunset glow and wait for the creek to flow. Capitola, sway to the ocean's roar. Beside the strand we'll hear the band down by the shore.